Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Lichter, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project for the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I am a member of the Kenosha History Center and have volunteered there since 2015. We hope that you will enjoy these programs. I'm speaking with Karl Frederick, former employee of the Kenosha News. Karl, when did you start working for the Kenosha News?
Well, I started working at the Kenosha News in February of 1975.
Okay. Are you originally from Kenosha?
I am. I was born in Kenosha, left when my parents, my father got a job in West Bend. And so I went through 5th grade here, and I left, graduated high school in West Bend, went to school for 2 years at a UW satellite campus, and went to UWM after that. And
okay. What did you do for the Kenosha News, and what department did you work at?
well, I worked in the newsroom, and I did just about every job one can have in the newsroom. I started as a reporter, moved on to copy editor, which were people who read the stories a second time after the city editor read them. And then I'd also be in charge of placing stories on a page as a copy editor. Then I became news editor, which supervised the overall production of the newspaper and supervising the copy editors. Then from there I became Sunday editor. Actually, before news editor, it was a planning and designing of a 72-page Sunday paper. The Kenosha News had never had a Sunday paper. They had published from Monday through Saturday. But in the planning and in the discussion of the Sunday paper, it was decided that we would eliminate the Saturday. So Sunday became the big day of the week, and I was in charge of most everything that was in the Sunday paper, except for the final night of the live news. From that, I then also became the managing editor, interim editor for a short time between editors. Then I was managing editor again, also assignment editor for a time, features editor. There was just a whole bunch of stuff going on and changing and evolving, and I was pretty much there for all of that. I also worked on special sections that were done throughout the year. Your bridal section, your car care section, big Thanksgiving Day paper that Mr. Brown always wanted to say it weighed 3.5 pounds or whatever, whatever the weight was of it. So then, I left, retired in 2013, and that was a good time for me to leave.
What was your typical workday like throughout all those different assignments?
Depending on my job, the workday would change. Now, when the Kenosha News was an afternoon newspaper, and I was a reporter, I would come in and start about 8 o'clock in the morning, work until about 4:30 or so, and then I would be done, unless one of the editors told me they needed me to cover a meeting at night, either because the person who usually covered it was on vacation, or because they just needed somebody to cover a meeting that they weren't planning on covering initially. And as you moved into different roles, the copy editing was probably about the same when the paper was afternoon. Editors, they could be there anytime. And then when the paper switched to morning, then everybody's schedules were flipped pretty much. Copy editors became 4 o'clock in the afternoon and midnight people. There was an editor or two that worked at night. Otherwise, people pretty much kept their day hours.
Okay. What, how are the wages or benefits? Were you a wage or were you a salary?
Well, I was paid hourly, actually weekly, as what it was. When I was hired by the Kenosha News, they asked me, how much experience have you had? Because they had a union already, and they had a scale, a 6-year scale that you would be placed on in order to get to the top of what they would pay. And I didn't know what they really wanted to do with me, so I didn't know exactly what I should say, but they said, you just pick it. Pick how many years of experience, where you want to be placed. And I just figured maybe with my previous work at the West Bend newspaper that I would say I had a year of experience. So that set me at $1.95 a week.
Okay. How about training when you walked in there in 1975?
Well, the training was, we've seen what you know how to do. You'll be doing a lot of that here. So there was no real training. There wasn't a mentor who kind of helped you around. Basically, we're given some responsibility, but for me, I was considered a general assignment reporter, which means you were available to cover anything, whatever they wanted you to do that day, whether it was do the police beat or go chase a fire or go to some school that had a program. You were just available all the time.
In 1975, what was the technology, or what was your workspace like?
Well, I remember having a manual typewriter at a desk which had nothing on it. The phone wasn't there yet, but it did come soon after, but it felt kind of odd initially that here's your empty desk and you had a manual typewriter. There was plenty of space, you know, you don't need a whole lot of space, just need room to type and room to either look at things or notes, so there was plenty of space.
What were some of the challenges or difficulties to your job?
Well, difficulties would be power outages. Difficulties depending on the job. As a reporter, difficulty would be finding someone to talk to, depending on whether you were covering a fire and try to find the person in the fire department who is responsible at the scene and follow up later maybe on what actually happened at the end. Going to a school, you'd have to talk to the teacher and get to know the performer enough to watch what they were doing and understand, and find a way to talk to maybe some of the kids, get them to open up and tell you what they thought about the program and how their reaction was. As a copy editor, you had to worry about whether or not the stories were being done on time. Reporters notorious for working up until their last minute to finish their stories, and that would leave the copy editors rushing to get the stories on the pages and get the press started on time. So it all depended on your job, you know, what kind of difficulties you might have. Now, difficulty, like I said, I was hired in February, and what I had been doing was kind of hit and miss. I started in January and I took my resume and clips of stories I had written, jumped in my car and covered most of east and southeast Wisconsin. I'd go up to Green Bay, Appleton, Oshkosh, Fond du Lac one day. Next day I would head out west and I would go to Milwaukee, then Madison, and points in between there. And then another day I'd go down to Racine and Kenosha, Janesville, and points in between if I knew there were some. But when I stopped at the Kenosha News, I brought in my material, and they took it from me and took it upstairs to the editor. The newsroom was on the second floor of the building on 58th Street. So I stood there and waited, and the editor came down, told me to follow him upstairs after he perused my stuff. He sat me down in his office and told me to wait. I didn't know how long I was going to wait. It felt like a long time, but it probably was only a few minutes. And he came back and said, come with me, and we went downstairs to the publisher's office, the owner, Howard Brown, and he happened to be in his office talking on the phone with his back to the door, so he didn't see us. The editor put the folder down and left, and I listened to Mr. Brown talk to one of the readers who happened to be complaining about the small type in the comics that day. So when he finished that conversation, I don't know that the caller won anything, because he can't do much about the comic type. It's the way it comes. And he turned around in his desk and he looked at me and asked, why are you here today? And I said, well, I'm applying for a job. And he looked at the material and said, all right. We chatted, and then he said, thank you. How did you know there was a job open? I said, well, I've been all over this part of the state, day by day, looking for some place that might have a job open. And no, this is a coincidence, I guess. And he said, okay. And I left feeling pretty good about the conversation. And a couple of days later, he called me and told me that it was a part-time job that I could have. They had another person in mind for a full-time position. So I said, all right, would you be interested in that? And I said, well, yes. So he said I would be paid $100 a week at that time to be a part-time reporter, but do nothing until April. So the idea was from mid-February until sometime in April, I would just be getting a $100 check each week, which seemed odd to me, like, well, why am I getting paid for not working? And I learned later, or at least I understood that later, that the newspaper guild, the union that covered the people who worked in the newsroom, and the company were negotiating a contract. And one of the things the company had wanted to insert in the contract was the ability to hire part-time employees, which up until then, I understand they did not allow. Mm-hmm. So that was the idea for me to be waiting so that when the contract was settled, I could be a part-time reporter. Well, a few days later, he called and told me that the person that they had selected for the full-time position had taken another job. He wanted to work for a magazine or something, and so I could have a full-time job. So it kind of fell in my lap.
How many employees were at Kenosha News?
In all of the departments, at one point, I remember about 160 perhaps.
Okay. And at one point, or for a certain period of time, the paper was actually published there, printed in Kenosha, correct?
It was. It was printed in Kenosha until probably the early 2000s.
Oh, wow.
And then it got to the point where the equipment that the Kenosha News had for so many years was getting old, and maintenance was costly, and they were not sure they were able to afford a new press, which can cost millions and millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. So they decided they would look and see if there was another place they could publish. And at that time, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel had a printing plant outside of their offices, and they would print variety of materials, sections for such and such magazines. Perhaps they published, I think, they ran USA Today off of their printing plant. And so we were able to make a 5-year agreement with the Journal-Sentinel at that time that they would print our newspaper. And so that's why we went there. People started complaining that the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel was deciding what was going to be in the Kenosha News, and we had a hard time explaining that actually the paper was being published in a separate printing plant, completely separate from the Journal-Sentinel news gathering service.
Okay.
And it took a while. I'm not sure everybody figured it out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What about the culture there, like management relationships, and did you have activities or?
Well, my experience was that it was very familial. I mean, it was a family-owned paper. Mr. Howard Brown had purchased it in the early 60s. And the Schulte family, who had a partial ownership before, maintained some bit of the ownership. So there was two families involved, and Howard was particularly interested in the newsroom and advertising, whereas Mr. Schulte was interested in the circulation and that part of the operation. So the culture was, pretty close, pretty familiar. I mean, you could talk to anybody anywhere you wanted. You had to go downstairs at the time to take a break in the morning, and you'd run into other people from different departments also on their break. There was no set time. It was, well, I think now is a good time for me to go downstairs, and then others who decided they'd like to chat with you or something might go down at the same time. Now, there was no regulation in terms of how fast you had to get back. I mean, the understanding was 15 minutes, but it wasn't always 15 minutes, and there was no clock to punch in and out of. Basically filled out a time card at the end of each week. And so people got to chat and learn about each other, especially for me in the newsroom, to learn more about the people in the newsroom. Later on, I got to wanting to talk to people in the accounting department and the advertising department, the printing press people, everybody. And I made friends in all of the departments. So it was very collegial that way. A lot of people in the newsroom wouldn't deal with people outside of their department. Not because they despised them or anything, it's just that they were content to be around their own. Okay. A few of them, I'm sure, had people cross departments. But I particularly made it a point. We had Christmas parties every year. We had a picnic outside recent years that I was there. We had a softball team. Mr. Brown was a catcher for a while on that team. And you can imagine from the way he normally spoke, how he would chat up a batter behind the plate. So we had people in every department on the softball team. You could be on it if you were a full-time employee and male. Now, later on they had volleyball teams with women on, and I don't know if they had a softball team. We also had a basketball team. Again, same involvement. So we got to know each other kind of well, and we had fun, and afterwards we go out and talk about work, or talk about family, talk about just about anything. So I got to know a lot of people all over, and it was a lot of fun to meet those people and do things with those people outside.
Did you live close to work, or drive, or walk?
I lived about 4 miles away from work. And I drove because I had to have a car. I mean, they didn't require it, but if I was going to be sent on an assignment, I had better get there. I better get back, and then they couldn't afford me to walk 2 miles to cover something and then walk 2 miles back. It's like, no, you got to get there, you got to do the story, you got to come back and write it up. So it's like you had to have a car.
Was there compensation for using your own vehicle?
Mileage.
Yeah, okay.
There was a mileage rate based on the Department of Labor, I think, is the one who sets that.
Okay. What were the circumstances with the end of your employment?
Well, things had shifted a lot over the last maybe 12 years of my employment. We had gone into taping a video newscast at noon that was later broadcast on Community Media. And I was involved in writing the scripts for that newscast. I was responsible for all the reporters and what they did, and them getting their stories done on time. I supervised the editors of other departments in the sense that they could get along and do what they wanted, but if there was a disagreement, oftentimes it would have to come through me to decide how we were going to end up with that, and make sure that all the other departments had their work done on time so we could get the paper out to being printed.
Okay. Good. What was the best thing, or what did you enjoy the most about working for the Kenosha News?
The changeability, the day-to-day not knowing what was happening. I mean, who knew 9/11 was going to happen? Who knew, you know?
Wow. Yeah.
So it was like you walk in thinking, all right, things are going to be quiet today, and all of a sudden there's a fire, maybe a shooting, and it was like, all right, now we've got something else going on, and now we have to change our plan for the day and come up with a new one. So that was always an interesting part of the job. It was not often very calm and we'll just sit back and let people do their job. There's always something that would come up that would make us change that. So that made it real interesting. And the people, of course, coming from the various jobs, coverage assignments they had. And also the newsroom was generally have an idea of what they thought about things. They weren't afraid to share their opinions with each other in the newsroom. So if you wanted to hear an argument, one might pop up someday, depending on that. But yeah, and I loved working just because it was a family newspaper. You know, I mean, Mr. Brown was always there. So it was like you didn't have to worry about them communicating upwards to somebody out of town. So that was always nice doing that.
Okay, do you have anything else you'd like to share? Maybe a story or a specific experience?
Well, there's a couple of things that come to mind. Personally, Mr. Brown at one point knew that the circus was coming to town. There used to be a circus almost every year that set up their tents on 30th Avenue and 52nd Street. And one morning he asked if I was going to take my kids to the circus. And I said, probably not. And he said, no, you have to take your kids to the circus. Kids have to get to the circus at least once in their life. So he said he would get me tickets to go to the circus with my family, and he also gave me money so that the kids could buy things and have something to eat while they were there.
Wow.
So that was unusual. Also, kind of professional, if you would say. There was a time when we were trying to put out a Saturday paper, which again was reestablished later. I don't know, once we didn't have a Saturday paper at first with the Sunday, then we brought it back because we needed to. That was a case of Alton Coleman, who had abducted a Kenosha girl, and who later, her body was found in Waukegan, and that set an uproar. Like, why did my baby get taken? And we got to catch him. And Alton Coleman and his girlfriend, who I believe her name was Denise Brown, I'm not positive of the first name, but they went on a 6-state killing spree where they killed about 7 people in 6 states over the course of a handful of months. And the day he was captured in Illinois actually was 3 o'clock or so on a Friday afternoon at a time when there was no Saturday paper. So we wondered, what are we going to do? We can't wait till Sunday to tell people this. We got to tell them today. So, and this was about 1984. So the department heads of advertising and circulation and the newsroom and accounting, because they would have to pay for it, unless we had enough advertising. And while they debated the best course of action, the city editor at the time and myself as news editor planned out what we would do if we were going to publish something, and mapped out stories. We had a photographer down in Evanston, Illinois when he was captured, and we sent a reporter down to talk to the people there. We sent a reporter over to the neighborhood where the little girl had lived to talk to them about reacting to the capture. And we created maps, and we had other stories. We kind of retold the whole story over the period of time, and paper was delivered free on Saturday. So that was wonderful to see that paper would do that. Another experience was not quite so professional as it is, but I was working Saturday morning before the Sunday paper was published. And normally we had computers at that time, you know, squared off things with green letters, green background type. Yeah. And we got into work that morning, and the computer system was down, so we couldn't use the computers, which is pretty important to get our stories into the paper. So we started trying to figure out a new way around it. It was also the system that set our headline type. So we could put a headline on a story, and the story would be then pasted onto a paper page. Well, that wasn't working. And then we had a backup headline machine, which also happened to not work when we tried to get that to. So we were left with how are we going to get the obituaries in the paper, which you don't go without an obituary. So somebody typed the obituaries on a typewriter, and we just printed it out, pasted it just the way it came off the typewriter, not anything like it looks in the news generally. And we couldn't set any stories, so we went to, we had galleys of type, kind of like a harder type of paper with wax on the back, which would stick them. And we looked around and see which ones of those we could use to fill the paper. We couldn't set headlines, so we found letters from maybe what we had in the galley type, or even in other newspapers, to try to create headlines. We even tried to make an italicized letter look like it was straight up and down instead of slanted, and it took a long time. Everybody who happened to be in the building that day, you know, pitched in from the accounting department. Mr. Brown came up and helped do it until I think we finally finished the paper at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon instead of like 12:30. And then we went out and kind of celebrated getting it done. So,
Yeah,
you know.
wow. Good. Okay. Well, thank you, Karl, for sharing your memories and your experience.
Well, thank you, Bob.